a shredded thrift store coat, a trembling, tear-streaked Maid, and a ruthless underworld boss who had just put 2 bullets into an assassin's chest, only to turn his terrifying gaze on the woman shivering on his floor. She expected a bullet. Instead, he gripped the ruined wool, tore the one thing hiding her heavy, beautiful body from the world completely in half, and roared to his men, "Get Arturo on the phone! Bring the best tailor in New York, now!" Clara Higgins did not exist. At least, that was the unspoken rule at the sprawling, heavily fortified Bianchi estate in the Hudson Valley. At 25, Clara was the girl who polished the imported Carrara marble floors until they gleamed like glass. She was the one who dusted the Murano chandeliers in the grand foyer, taking care not to breathe too heavily, lest she disturb the fragile crystal. But most importantly, she was the girl who stayed out of the way. Clara was fat. It wasn't a word she shied away from in her own mind, even if society tried to dress it up in polite euphemisms like curvy or big-boned. She was undeniably, heavily fat, a fact that had dictated the terms of her life since childhood. In a world, and particularly in the high-end domestic service industry, that prized invisibility and sleek uniform perfection, Clara stuck out. Her thighs rubbed together, her stomach pressed against the rigid waistbands of her cheap polyester uniforms, and her cheeks were perpetually flushed from the sheer physical exertion of keeping up with the relentless demands of the head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable was a cruel woman who ran the Bianchi household like a military barracks. She despised Clara's size, frequently muttering under her breath about how a girl of her proportions had no business working in a house of this caliber. Clara endured it because she had to. Her older brother, Tommy, had a gambling addiction that kept them perpetually on the edge of eviction from their cramped apartment in Yonkers. To survive the glaring eyes and the silent judgments, Clara had developed a strategy. The coat. It was a monstrosity of a garment. An oversized, threadbare, charcoal grey men's wool overcoat she had bought for $12 at a Salvation Army. The lining was torn, the pockets sagged, and it smelled faintly of mothballs and stale rain. But to Clara, it was armor. Whenever her shift ended, she would wrap herself in it, burying her large breasts, her wide hips, and her soft stomach beneath yards of heavy, scratchy fabric. Inside the coat, she wasn't a fat, exhausted maid. She was just a shapeless shadow slipping out the servants' entrance into the cold New York night. But tonight, the shadows in the Bianchi estate were restless. Lorenzo Bianchi was coming home. Lorenzo was the undisputed head of the Bianchi crime family, a man whose name was whispered in boardroom meetings in Manhattan and backroom poker games in Brooklyn alike. For 2 years, he had been operating out of Palermo, Sicily, consolidating power, ruthlessly expanding his empire. His sudden return to the States had set the estate on high alert. Men in dark suits with telltale bulges under their arms patrolled the perimeter with increased urgency. Blacked-out Cadillac Escalades idled in the circular driveway. Clara had never seen the boss. She had only cleaned his private study, a massive room smelling of aged leather, expensive Cuban cigars, and Macallan whiskey. "Keep your head down, Higgins," Mrs. Gable snapped, her bony fingers gripping a clipboard as Clara furiously polished the banister of the grand staircase. "Mr. Bianchi arrives in 20 minutes. If he sees you sweating on his mahogany, I will have you thrown out by your ear. He expects perfection, not whatever you call this." She gestured vaguely at Clara's soft, rounded figure, encased in a tight black uniform that clung uncomfortably to her rolls. Clara swallowed hard, her eyes glued to the wood. "Yes, Mrs. Gable. I'm almost finished." "Finish faster. Then take the back stairs to the staff lockers. Get your dreadful things and leave. I don't want you on the property when he walks through those doors." Clara scrubbed until her knuckles ached, as the heavy rumble of engines echoed through the front courtyard, signaling the arrival of the motorcade. She grabbed her supplies and fled to the servant quarters. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic bird trapped in a heavy cage. She changed out of her uniform as quickly as her body would allow, pulling on her cheap jeans and a faded sweater. Finally, she reached for the grey coat. She slid her arms into the frayed sleeves, pulling the oversized lapels tight across her chest, tying the belt tightly around her waist to completely obscure her shape. She let out a long breath. Safe. She grabbed her canvas tote bag and hurried out the heavy steel service door into the biting November wind, completely unaware that she was walking straight into a bloodbath. The storm had rolled in off the Hudson River, bringing with it a freezing, sideways rain that immediately soaked through the thin canvas of Clara's shoes. She kept her head down, the collar of her monstrous grey coat pulled up around her ears, trudging toward the staff parking lot where her rusted Honda Civic waited. The main courtyard was chaotic. Through the sheet of rain, Clara could see a line of black SUVs. Men were shouting in Italian, moving swiftly toward the grand double doors of the mansion. At the center of the phalanx was a man who seemed to absorb the ambient light, Lorenzo Bianchi. Even from a distance, through the blur of rain and darkness, his presence was magnetic and terrifying. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke midnight blue suit that clung to his broad shoulders, his dark hair slicked back by the rain. Clara paused by a tall, manicured hedge, wanting to let the dangerous men pass before she crossed the driveway. She hugged her arms across her chest, the wet wool of her coat smelling sharply of wet dog and old dust. Then the night shattered. It didn't sound like in the movies. The gunfire was a series of sharp, deafening cracks that echoed off the stone facade of the mansion. Crack, crack, crack. A man in front of Lorenzo crumpled, a blossoming red stain ruining his white shirt. Screams erupted. Men drew weapons instantly, the sleek black steel of suppressed Glock pistols gleaming under the security floodlights. Clara froze. Her brain completely shut down. She stood paralyzed by the hedge, her large body a sitting duck in the peripheral glow of the lights. A black sedan had breached the front gate and was tearing up the driveway, windows rolled down, automatic weapons, spitting fire. The rival Falcone family had made their move. "Get the boss inside! Return fire!" someone bellowed. Bullets chewed through the hedges inches from Clara's face, showering her in shredded wet leaves and twigs. She let out a piercing, terrified scream, dropping her tote bag. Lorenzo, who had drawn his own weapon and was moving toward the stone pillars of the portico with lethal, practiced calm, snapped his head toward the sound. He saw her, a massive, shapeless grey lump standing paralyzed in the crossfire. Without thinking, Lorenzo broke cover. He moved with a terrifying, predatory speed, lunging across the 10 feet of open space just as a line of bullets traced the asphalt where he had been standing. He slammed into Clara. The impact was like being hit by a freight train. Clara had 220 pounds on her frame, but the sheer kinetic force of the Mafia boss knocked her completely off her feet. They went down hard onto the slick, wet cobblestones, Lorenzo's heavy, muscular body covering hers, shielding her from the spray of shrapnel as a bullet shattered a nearby stone planter. "Keep your head down!" Lorenzo roared over the deafening noise, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated right through her chest. He fired 3 times over his shoulder. A man in the attacking sedan screamed, and the vehicle swerved wildly, crashing into a stone fountain before Lorenzo's men riddled it with bullets. Silence fell over the courtyard, broken only by the hiss of the rain and the groans of the dying. Clara lay on her back, hyperventilating, completely disoriented. Lorenzo rolled off her, holstering his weapon in one fluid motion. He grabbed the lapels of her monstrous grey coat to haul her roughly to her feet. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his dark, dangerous eyes scanning her face. I... Clara stuttered, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely speak. In his urgency to check her for wounds, Lorenzo pulled her forward, but Clara's foot slipped on the wet cobblestones. She pitched backward. Lorenzo held tight to the coat to keep her from cracking her skull on the ground. The ancient, rotting seams of the cheap wool finally gave way. There was a loud, sickening "ip." The back of the coat tore completely in half, from the collar down to the hem. The heavy fabric peeled away from Clara's body like a husk, leaving her standing in the freezing rain in nothing but her thin, wet sweater and tight jeans. The armor was gone. Clara gasped, a raw sound of sheer humiliation. The rain plastered her thin clothes to her body, highlighting every roll of her stomach, the heavy swell of her large breasts, the wide flare of her hips. The men around them, hardened killers, bodyguards, fixers, briefly looked over as the danger passed, their eyes landing on the fat, soaking wet girl trembling in the ruins of a beggar's coat. Tears of absolute mortification welled in Clara's eyes. She scrambled back, trying desperately to pull the ruined flaps of the coat over her chest, trying to hide herself. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, backing away, her face burning with a shame hotter than the gunfire. "I'm sorry. Please don't look. Please," she expected him to scoff, to push her away in disgust. But Lorenzo Bianchi didn't look disgusted. His eyes darkened, fixing on her full, trembling figure with an intensity that made her breath catch. He looked at the heavy, soft curves of her body, then down at the shredded, pathetic piece of garbage fabric in his hand. A muscle feathered in his tight jaw. His gaze wasn't repulsed. It was furious. But not at her. "Who?" Lorenzo asked softly, his voice cutting through the rain with deadly precision. "Allowed a woman working in my house to walk out into the cold wearing a piece of garbage?" The remaining bodyguards exchanged nervous glances. No one answered. Lorenzo dropped the torn half of the coat onto the wet ground. He stepped forward, shrugging off his own bespoke, heavy wool suit jacket. It was warm, lined with silk, and smelled of sandalwood and expensive tobacco. Before Clara could protest, he draped it over her broad shoulders. It fit her, completely enveloping her shivering form. "Come inside," Lorenzo ordered. It wasn't a request. "I have to go home," Clara whispered, terrified of him, terrified of the dead men in the driveway, terrified of her own exposed body. Lorenzo stepped closer, his imposing frame blocking out the rain and the flashing security lights. He reached out, his knuckles brushing a wet strand of hair from her tear-streaked cheek. The gentleness of the gesture was entirely at odds with the blood on his hands. "You aren't going anywhere," he murmured. He turned to his underboss. Lock down the estate, and get Arturo Pena on the phone. Arturo? The tailor, boss. It's midnight. Lorenzo's eyes flashed with violent authority. I don't care if he's sleeping. Drag him out of bed and get him here. Bring the best tailor in New York. Now. The interior of the Bianchi estate was a hive of chaotic efficiency. Men were dragging bodies away, scrubbing blood from the porch, and shouting into burner phones. Lorenzo bypassed them all, his hand resting heavily, possessively on the small of Clara's back, guiding her through the massive mahogany doors and into the grand foyer. Clara felt entirely numb. The adrenaline crash had left her legs feeling like lead, and the luxurious warmth of Lorenzo's jacket wrapped around her only made her feel more like an imposter. She dripped rainwater onto the pristine Carrara marble she had polished just hours ago. Mrs. Gable emerged from the servants' corridor, her face pale, clutching her robe. Mr. Bianchi? Thank God you're safe. We heard the... Her eyes landed on Clara. The head housekeeper's expression twisted into immediate revulsion. Higgins, what in the world are you doing here? You're ruining the floor. Get out the back this instant. Quiet. Lorenzo's voice didn't rise above a conversational volume, but it snapped through the foyer like a bullwhip. Mrs. Gable's mouth clicked shut. Lorenzo looked at the housekeeper, his dark eyes cold and calculating. She works here. She's a maid, sir. One of the lower staff, Mrs. Gable stammered, intimidated by the sheer menace radiating from her boss. She walked out of my house in a coat fit for a stray dog, Lorenzo said dangerously. She was almost killed in my driveway. And you are worried about the floor? Sir, she is completely unpresentable. Pack your bags, Lorenzo said coldly. You have 10 minutes to get off my property. If I see your face in my house again, you will be buried beneath it. Mrs. Gable gasped, bursting into tears, and fled. Clara stood frozen. This powerful, terrifying man had just fired the woman who had terrorized her for years, simply for insulting her. Why? She was nothing. She was just the fat, invisible maid. Lorenzo guided Clara into his private study. The room was warm, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that crackled with a roaring fire. He directed her to a plush, oversized leather Chesterfield sofa. Sit, he commanded gently. He walked over to a crystal decanter, poured a generous measure of Macallan 25, and walked back to her. Drink this. It will help with the shock. Clara took the glass with trembling hands. The amber liquid burned her throat, but it sent a rush of necessary heat through her system. She looked up at Lorenzo. He was standing by the fireplace, studying her. He had taken off his shoulder holster, laying the weapon on his desk. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the dark hair on his chest and a silver chain. I'm sorry about my coat, Clara whispered, staring down at her lap. Her thighs spread wide on the leather couch, a stark reminder of her size. I didn't mean to get in your way. I know I'm a lot to move. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. He walked over, crouching down right in front of her, forcing her to look him in the eyes. Never apologize for your size, he said, his voice a low rumble. There is nothing wrong with your body, Clara. She blinked, shocked that he knew her name. Shocked that he was looking at her heavy curves with an expression that bordered on reverence. How do you know my name? She asked. Before Lorenzo could answer, the heavy oak doors of the study opened. 2 armed guards escorted a flustered, impeccably dressed older man, carrying a leather valise. It was Arturo Penna, the most exclusive bespoke tailor in Manhattan. He looked terrified, having clearly been dragged out of his penthouse in the middle of the night. "Don Lorenzo," Arturo swallowed hard, bowing slightly. "I came as quickly as I could. What requires my services at this ungodly hour?" Lorenzo stood up, his towering frame dominating the room. He gestured to Clara. "She requires your services, Arturo." Arturo looked at Clara, his trained eyes immediately assessing her size. He tried to hide a wince, used to dressing the impossibly thin, statuesque mob wives and mistresses of New York's elite. For the young lady?" "Don Lorenzo, I specialize in men's suiting and evening wear for a very specific demographic." "You specialize in making clothes fit the body," Lorenzo said, his tone turning lethally quiet. "You will measure her. You will design a wardrobe for her. Casual wear, evening wear, coats. Everything. I want the finest silk, cashmere, and wool you can source. If she ever has to hide herself in cheap, poorly fitted garbage again, Arturo, I will personally break both of your hands. Do you understand?" Arturo paled, nodding frantically. "Yes, boss, absolutely. We will make her look like a queen." "She is a queen," Lorenzo corrected softly, his eyes never leaving Clara's flushed face. Clara felt a dizzying mixture of fear and something dangerously close to desire. "Mr. Bianchi, please. I can't afford this. I'm just a maid. I make minimum wage. I need this job to support my brother." At the mention of her brother, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lorenzo slowly walked over to his massive mahogany desk. He picked up a manila folder, the leather of his shoes completely silent on the Persian rug. He walked back to Clara, tossing the folder onto the coffee table in front of her. "Your brother," Lorenzo said, his voice devoid of the warmth it had held seconds ago, "is Tommy Higgins." Clara's stomach plummeted. "Yes. Tommy Higgins owes my associates in Queens $85,000 in gambling debts," Lorenzo stated coldly. "Debts he incurred playing underground Texas Hold'em with money he stole from my crew." Clara couldn't breathe. The walls of the luxurious study felt like they were closing in. Tommy had sworn he was clean. He had sworn the late-night phone calls were just telemarketers. "But that isn't the worst part, Clara," Lorenzo continued, leaning over the table, his dark eyes boring into hers. "My security chief just finished interrogating the man who survived the attack in the driveway. The Falcone family knew exactly when I was arriving, and they knew exactly which gate would be understaffed. They bought the security schedules from an insider." Lorenzo tapped the manila folder. "They bought them from a desperate man who needed to clear an $85,000 debt. Your brother sold me out to the Falcones, Clara. He tried to have me killed tonight." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The room spun. Her own brother had set up the hit, and she was sitting in the private study of the man he had tried to assassinate. "I didn't know," Clara gasped, tears spilling over her cheeks. "I swear to you, Mr. Bianchi, I didn't know. Please don't kill him. Please don't kill me." Arturo the tailor stood frozen in the corner, clutching his measuring tape like a lifeline, terrified to witness a Mafia execution. Lorenzo looked at Clara's terrified face, at the heavy, beautiful curves, shivering beneath his jacket. The brutal code of the Cosa Nostra demanded blood. The penalty for treason was death, for the traitor and his entire bloodline. Lorenzo reached down, cupping Clara's jaw in his large, calloused hand. His thumb stroked her tear-stained cheek. "I am not going to kill you, Clara," Lorenzo whispered, his eyes burning with a dark, possessive obsession. "But your brother's life belongs to me now, and to pay his debt, so do you." He turned to the trembling Tailor. "Measure her, Arturo. She's going to need an entirely new wardrobe for her new life. Clara is not leaving this estate again." The sprawling east wing of the Bianchi estate was a place Clara had previously only seen when she was assigned to deep clean the baseboards. Now, it was her prison. Lorenzo had placed her in a suite that rivaled the penthouses at the plaza. The walls were upholstered in pale grey silk. The bed was a massive antique mahogany four-poster, and the ensuite bathroom featured a sunken marble tub. But the heavy oak door locked from the outside, and a stoic bodyguard named Bruno stood stationed in the hallway 24 hours a day. The morning after the attack, Arturo Penna returned. The master tailor looked less terrified in the daylight, carrying a leather folio of sketches and dragging 3 assistants behind him, who hauled trunks of fabric swatches. Clara stood in the center of the plush bedroom, wearing a borrowed silk robe that belonged to Lorenzo. It dwarfed her, the dark fabric wrapping completely around her soft, wide waist. "Signorina Higgins," Arturo said, his tone entirely professional, stripped of the condescension he had shown the night before. Lorenzo's threat had clearly resonated. "We must begin. Don Lorenzo has requested a complete wardrobe within the week. Day wear, evening gowns, foundational garments. Everything." Clara swallowed hard, crossing her arms defensively over her large breasts. "I don't need evening gowns, I'm a prisoner." "You are a guest," Arturo corrected smoothly, though his eyes betrayed his knowledge of the truth. "Now please, the robe." Tears pricked Clara's eyes, but she had no choice. She let the robe drop to the floor, standing before the tailor and his assistants in a plain cotton camisole and cheap, stretched-out underwear. For her entire life, her body had been a source of public shame or invisible utility. She waited for the sneers. She waited for the assistants to exchange mocking glances at her thick thighs, the pronounced curve of her belly, the heavy weight of her arms. Instead, Arturo put on a pair of silver reading glasses and walked in a slow circle around her. "Fascinating," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He snapped his fingers. "Carmela, the measuring tape. Write this down." For the next hour, Arturo measured every inch of her. But something strange happened. As he called out the numbers, wide circumferences that would have previously made Clara want to die of embarrassment, Arturo's voice held only clinical respect. "Bust full. We will need internal corsetry for the evening wear, not to minimize, but to support and lift. Waist, pronounced curve. We use a bias cut for the skirts to let the fabric drape over the hips rather than constrict. Shoulders broad, beautiful canvas for a wide neckline. You have been wearing clothes designed for women, shaped like pencils," Arturo said suddenly, tapping his chin with his pen. "Cheap polyester that fights the body. Your figure, signorina, requires architecture. It requires weight and structure. Loro Piana cashmere, heavy Duchess satin. Fabrics that command space, rather than apologize for it." Clara stared at him, stunned. You don't think I need to lose weight to look presentable?" Arturo scoffed, a deeply offended Italian sound. "My job is not to change the woman to fit the dress. My job is to make the dress worship the woman. Don Lorenzo was very clear. We do not hide you." The mention of Lorenzo sent a shiver down Clara's spine. The Mafia boss had not visited her suite since he had locked her in it. That afternoon, her isolation was shattered. Bruno opened the door, stepping aside to let Lorenzo enter. The boss wore a charcoal suit, looking rested, immaculate, and utterly lethal. Behind him, two enforcers dragged a bruised, trembling man into the room. "Tommy!" Clara screamed, lunging forward. Her brother collapsed onto the plush rug, his face battered, his clothes smelling of stale beer and the cheap cigarettes he smoked outside the Aqueduct racetrack. He looked up at Clara, his eyes wide with panic. "Clara, tell them to let me go. I didn't know it was a hit. I swear to God," Tommy blubbered, spitting blood onto the rug. Lorenzo held up a single hand. The room fell dead silent. He walked over to a velvet armchair, sitting down slowly, his dark eyes fixed on Tommy. "You sold the security detail of my home to the Falcone family for $85,000, Lorenzo said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "A home where your own sister worked. Did you care that she would be in the crossfire, Thomas? Did you care that she was walking through the courtyard when the shooting started?" Tommy scrambled back, shaking his head. "I thought they were just going to rob the vault. I didn't know they were sending hitters. Please, Mr. Bianchi, I'll get the money. I'll pay you back double." "You don't have a dime," Lorenzo stated coldly. "The penalty for treason against the Bianchi family is death. I should put a bullet in your head right here on my carpet." "No!" Clara threw herself between Lorenzo and her brother, her soft, heavy body shielding Tommy's pathetic frame. "Please. You promised. You said you wouldn't kill him." Lorenzo looked at Clara, his gaze sweeping over her terrified face and the soft curves heaving with panicked breaths. "I did. I told you, Clara, his life belongs to me. And you are the payment." Lorenzo leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Tell her, Thomas. Tell your sister how you tried to pay off your debt last month, before you went to the Falcones." Tommy froze, the color completely drained from his face. He looked at Clara, then away, shame radiating from his pores. "Tell her," Lorenzo growled, a feral edge entering his voice. I offered them a deal," Tommy whispered, staring at the floor. "To the loan sharks." Clara's heart pounded. "What deal, Tommy?" "I told them." Tommy swallowed hard. "I told them I had a sister, that she worked in the Bianchi house. I told them I could give you to them, to pay it off, to work in one of their clubs, or whatever they wanted." The air in the room vanished. Clara felt as though she had been punched in the stomach. Her own brother. The brother she had scrubbed floors for. The brother she had endured Mrs. Gable's cruelty for, had tried to sell her to Mafia loan sharks to cover a poker debt. "They laughed at me," Tommy sobbed. "They said nobody would want a fat maid to pay off 80 grand. So I went to the Falcones with the security codes instead." Clara stepped back from her brother as if he were a poisonous snake. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. She was completely alone in the world. She had sacrificed her youth, her dignity, and her body for a man who viewed her as discarded collateral. Lorenzo stood up. He walked over to Clara, ignoring Tommy completely. He gently took her trembling hands in his. "The loan sharks laughed because they are blind fools who deal in cheap flesh," Lorenzo said softly, his thumbs tracing her knuckles. "But when they brought the offer to my desk for approval, Clara, I didn't laugh. I looked into your background. I watched you. I saw how you carried the weight of the world on those beautiful shoulders. I saw a woman of immense strength, wrapped in a beggar's coat. Lorenzo turned his head slightly toward his enforcers. Take Thomas to the docks. Put him on a freighter bound for Naples. If he ever sets foot in the United States again, kill him. Clara, no! Help me! Tommy shrieked as the men dragged him out of the room, his voice echoing down the hall before the heavy oak door slammed shut. Clara stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. She was utterly unmoored. He's gone, Lorenzo murmured, stepping closer until the heat of his body radiated against hers. Your burden is gone. You owe him nothing. Your loyalty, your life, your body, they belong to me now. 3 weeks passed. The frantic, terrifying energy of the assassination attempt settled into a cold, heavily armed war between the Bianchi and Falcone families. The estate was a fortress, and Clara was its most guarded treasure. Her transformation was absolute. Arturo Penna had delivered on his promise. Clara's closet was now filled with garments that felt alien to her touch, but divine on her skin. Gone were the suffocating polyester uniforms and the horrific, shapeless grey coat. In their place were custom pieces engineered to celebrate her size. Wide-leg silk trousers that moved like liquid when she walked. Cashmere wrap sweaters that cinched at her waist and draped beautifully over her full bust. A heavy, double-breasted wool trench coat in deep burgundy that fit her shoulders perfectly and flared at the hips. When she looked in the gilded mirror, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. She wasn't just fat anymore. She was powerful. She took up space, and the clothes demanded that people respect that space. But beautiful clothes did not change the fact that she was a captive. One evening, Bruno escorted her down to the formal dining room. This was a new development. For 3 weeks, she had eaten in her suite. Tonight, Lorenzo had summoned her. As Clara approached the heavy mahogany doors, she heard voices bleeding into the hallway. It's a distraction, Lorenzo, a harsh, gravelly voice said. Clara recognized it as Dominic Rossi, Lorenzo's ruthless underboss. You've got a dozen men guarding the East Wing for a maid. The Falcones are hitting our shipments at the port, and you're playing house with a heavy girl whose brother sold us out. The capos are whispering. It looks weak. Clara froze. The old instincts flared up, the urge to shrink, to hide, to apologize for her existence. Let them whisper, Lorenzo's voice replied, cold and deadly. The men in this family will respect what is mine, or I will cut out their tongues. Her brother's sins are not hers. She is under my protection. Protection is one thing. Putting her at the head table tonight is another. You're making her a target, boss. And frankly, she doesn't fit in this world. She's not built for it. Clara looked down at herself. She was wearing one of Arturo's masterpieces, a deep emerald green velvet gown with a sweetheart neckline that highlighted her curves, paired with black satin heels. She felt beautiful, but Dominic's words triggered every insecurity she had ever harbored. She doesn't fit. The door opened suddenly. Bruno had announced her presence. The dining room was vast, dominated by a 20-foot table set with baccarat crystal and heavy silver. 6 men, the top lieutenants of the Bianchi family, sat around it. The air smelled of cigar smoke, roasted garlic, and danger. Every eye turned to Clara. For a split second, she wanted to turn and run back to her gilded cage. But then Lorenzo stood up from the head of the table. His eyes swept over her, taking in the emerald velvet, the way it clung to her waist and flared over her hips, the soft, pale swell of her cleavage. A dark, possessive hunger flared in his gaze, so intense it made Clara's breath hitch. Lorenzo didn't care about her weight. He didn't care that she wasn't a starving socialite. He looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. "Clara," Lorenzo said, his voice echoing in the silent room. He walked toward her, extending his hand. She took it, her soft hand swallowed by his large, rough one. He led her to the chair immediately, to his right, the seat of honor. Dominic Rossi, sitting across from her, stared with thinly veiled disdain. "Gentlemen," Lorenzo said, remaining standing as Clara sat down. He poured her a glass of Barolo wine himself. "I believe you all know Clara. She is no longer staff. She is a permanent resident of this estate." "With all due respect, Don Lorenzo," Dominic started, leaning back in his chair. "We are in the middle of a war. Is it wise to bring an outsider into the inner circle? Especially one with family ties to our enemies?" Lorenzo's hand moved so far, Clara barely registered it. He grabbed the heavy crystal wine decanter and smashed it across Dominic's jaw. The underboss went down hard, crashing to the floor in a shower of shattered glass and red wine that looked terrifyingly like blood. The other capos jumped, their hands hovering near their holstered weapons, but nobody drew. Lorenzo stood over Dominic, his chest heaving slightly, the veneer of the sophisticated businessman entirely stripped away, revealing the violent, apex predator beneath. "Clara has no family but me," Lorenzo snarled, kicking Dominic violently in the ribs. The other boss groaned in agony. "She is not an outsider. She is mine. And if any man at this table speaks of her with anything less than absolute reverence, I will feed you to the stray dogs in the Bronx. Do we have an understanding?" A chorus of tight, fearful agreements echoed around the table. "Yes, boss." "Understood, Don Lorenzo." Lorenzo straightened his cuffs, breathing heavily. He looked down at Dominic. "Clean yourself up and get it out of my sight." As Dominic scrambled away, clutching his bleeding face, Lorenzo sat back down. He picked up his napkin, calmly wiping a drop of wine from his knuckles. He turned to Clara, the terrifying violence vanishing from his eyes, replaced by that same burning devotion. "Eat, Mia Regina," Lorenzo commanded softly, pushing a plate of braised short ribs toward her. "You need your strength. The war is just beginning, and you are going to be right by my side through all of it." Clara looked at the plate, then at the terrified men around the table, and finally at the monster who had just shattered a man's face to defend her honor. The velvet noose hadn't just tightened, it had become her crown. December arrived in the Hudson Valley with a brutal, suffocating blizzard, burying the Bianchi estate under 3 feet of snow. Inside, the temperature was just as freezing. The war with the Falcone family had reached a bloody stalemate, and the tension among Lorenzo's capos was razor-thin. Clara had adapted to her gilded reality. She no longer walked with her shoulders hunched. She wore her bespoke wardrobe with a newfound, quiet dignity. Today she was wrapped in a thick, cream-colored Loro Piana cashmere sweater and heavy wool trousers that accentuated the dramatic flare of her hips. But despite the luxury, her instincts, honed by years of invisible servitude and survival, remained sharp. It was past midnight when she felt it. A subtle shift in the air pressure of the estate. Clara was reading in the massive library, nursing a cup of tea, when the central heating system suddenly clicked off. A moment later, the grand chandelier above her flickered and died. The estate was plunged into total darkness, save for the dying embers in the fireplace. The backup generators should have kicked in within 3 seconds. They didn't. Clara froze. The absolute silence was wrong. She crept to the heavy mahogany doors, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug, and pressed her ear against the wood. Down the hall, she heard the unmistakable muffled thwip of a suppressed gunshot. Then a heavy thud. Bruno, her bodyguard, had been stationed right outside. Panic, icy and sharp, spiked in her chest. She remembered Tommy's confession. They bought the security schedules. But Lorenzo had changed all the codes, rotated the guards, and fortified the gates. No one could get in from the outside unless someone on the inside had opened the door. Dominic Rossi. Lorenzo's underboss had never forgiven the humiliation in the dining room. He had been quietly festering, and now, under the cover of the blizzard, he had made his move. Clara didn't run to the main corridor. She knew exactly what a team of hit men would do. They would secure the main hallways, block the staircases, and close in on Lorenzo's private quarters in the West Wing. But Clara knew the estate better than any capo, hitman, or bodyguard. She knew the veins of the house. For years, Mrs. Gable had forced her to use the hidden servant corridors, a labyrinth of narrow, unlit passages built into the walls in the 1920s to ensure the staff remained completely unseen by the wealthy owners. Clara slipped behind the library's massive velvet curtains, feeling along the oak paneling until her fingers found the subtle groove of the hidden latch. She pressed hard. The panel clicked open, revealing a pitch-black, narrow corridor that smelled of old dust and copper pipes. She squeezed her heavy frame into the dark space, pulling the panel shut just as the library doors burst open. Flashlights swept the room she had just vacated. "She's not here," a gruff voice muttered. "Leave the fat bitch. Rossi said we take out Bianchi first, then we clean up the loose ends." Clara's blood ran cold. They were going for Lorenzo, moving as fast as her large body would allow. She navigated the pitch-black servants' corridor, her hands brushing against the rough brickwork. The passage was tight, her wide hips brushing the walls, but she didn't care. She used the service stairs, ascending to the second floor and rushing toward the master suite. She reached the hidden access door that opened directly behind the floor-to-ceiling mirror in Lorenzo's dressing room. She paused, pressing her ear to the wall. Gunfire erupted. It wasn't suppressed anymore. It was the deafening roar of Lorenzo's custom Sig Sauer P-226 echoing through his bedroom. Clara pushed the hidden latch and slipped into the dressing room. The door to the main bedroom was slightly ajar. Through the crack, she saw a nightmare unfolding. Lorenzo was bleeding from a graze on his left shoulder, taking cover behind a massive, overturned marble table. 4 men dressed in tactical black were pinned at the doorway, laying down suppressing fire. And standing safely in the hallway, barking orders, was Dominic Rossi. "He's out of ammunition in that mag," Dominic shouted. "Rush him! The Falcones promised us the Brooklyn ports when he's dead. Move!" Lorenzo popped out, firing 2 precise shots that dropped the first man. But his slide locked back. Empty. As he ducked to reload, the remaining 3 men surged forward into the room. Clara didn't think. The paralyzing fear that had once defined her life was entirely gone, replaced by a fierce, maternal rage. She refused to lose the only man who had ever truly seen her. She stepped out of the dressing room, completely flanking the hitmen. She grabbed the closest weapon available, a massive, solid brass statue of a rearing horse that sat on a pedestal near the door. It weighed at least 40 pounds, a cumbersome object for anyone else, but Clara hoisted it with the strength she had built, hauling laundry and scrubbing floors for a decade. The hitman closest to her raised his weapon toward Lorenzo. Clara let out a primal scream. She didn't just swing the statue. She threw her entire body weight behind it. 220 pounds of momentum, fueled by pure adrenaline, slammed into the hitman's blind side. The heavy brass crushed into the man's temple. The kinetic force of Clara's heavy body, colliding with his ribs, sent him flying sideways. He crashed through the glass balcony doors, his weapon skittering uselessly across the hardwood floor. The sudden, violent ambush from the heavy woman in the cashmere sweater stunned the remaining two hitmen for a crucial half-second. It was all Lorenzo needed. He slammed a fresh magazine into his Sig Sauer and fired twice, hitting both men squarely in the chest. They dropped instantly. Silence slammed back into the room, broken only by the howling wind blowing through the shattered balcony doors. Dominic Rossi stood in the hallway doorway, staring in absolute shock at his dead men, and at the panting, furious woman holding a bloody brass statue. He raised his gun toward Clara. "You stupid fat cow," Dominic spat. Bang! Dominic's eyes widened. A dark red circle appeared in the center of his forehead. He crumpled to the floor, dead before he hit the carpet. Lorenzo lowered his smoking gun. He was breathing heavily, his white shirt stained with blood from his shoulder, his dark hair falling into his eyes. He looked at the carnage, at his dead underboss, and finally, at Clara. Clara dropped the brass statue. Her hands were shaking violently. The adrenaline was draining, leaving her knees weak. I used the servant stairs," she stammered, suddenly feeling foolish. Lorenzo crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He kicked a fallen weapon out of the way, holstered his gun, and pulled Clara into a crushing embrace. "You magnificent, beautiful creature," Lorenzo breathed, burying his face in her hair. His good arm wrapped tightly around her wide waist, lifting her slightly off her toes. "You saved my life." Clara clung to his broad shoulders, burying her face in his chest, sobbing as the reality of what she had just done washed over her. "He was going to kill you. I couldn't let him. I couldn't." Lorenzo pulled back, framing her tear-streaked face with his large, blood-stained hands. He looked, not with gratitude, but with absolute terrifying devotion. "They thought you were a weakness," he whispered fiercely. "They thought because of your softness, because of your heart, you were a liability. They didn't see the queen beneath the maid's uniform. But I did." He kissed her. It was bruising, desperate, and tasted of gunpowder and salvation. Clara kissed him back, pouring every ounce of her long-suppressed passion into the man who had torn away her armor and given her a kingdom. The cleanup took a week. The deaths of Dominic Rossi and his co-conspirators sent a shockwave through the New York underworld. The Falcone family, realizing they had lost their inside man, and that Lorenzo Bianchi had survived an impossible ambush, sued for peace. The war ended not with a treaty, but with absolute surrender. But within the walls of the Bianchi estate, a different kind of permanent shift had occurred. Lorenzo's shoulder had been stitched by an underground mob doctor, but it was Clara who changed his bandages. She had moved out of the East Wing suite and into his master bedroom. There were no more bodyguards stationed at her door. She was no longer a prisoner. She was the lady of the house. 3 months later, spring brought a tentative bloom to the Hudson Valley. Clara stood on a pedestal in the grand solarium, bathed in golden afternoon sunlight. Arturo Penna was on his knees at the hem of her gown, his mouth full of pins, his assistants fluttering around like nervous sparrows. "Don't move, Signorina, please. The silk is unforgiving," Arturo mumbled around the pins. Clara looked at her reflection in the massive antique mirror. She was breathtaking. Arturo had outdone himself. The wedding gown was a masterpiece of heavy ivory Duchess satin. It didn't try to hide her body. It worshipped it. The gown featured a plunging neckline that showcased her full bust, supported by invisible expert corsetry. The heavy satin wrapped tightly around her waist, flaring out dramatically over her wide hips and cascading into a cathedral-length train. The fabric was so rich, so weighty, that it commanded the room. She looked powerful. She looked regal. She looked like a Mafia don's wife. "It is perfect," a deep voice rumbled from the doorway. Arturo and his assistants immediately stopped and bowed their heads as Lorenzo stepped into the solarium. He was dressed in a bespoke black tuxedo, looking incredibly handsome, the silver in his hair catching the light. "Leave us," Lorenzo ordered quietly. Arturo gathered his tools and scurried out, shutting the heavy glass doors behind him. Lorenzo walked slowly toward the pedestal. He reached up, his calloused hands resting on Clara's waist, spanning the heavy, beautiful curve of her hips covered in white satin. He looked up at her, his eyes dark with an emotion that bordered on religious reverence. "You are a vision, Clara," he murmured. "The most dangerous, beautiful thing in my world." Clara smiled, reaching down to trace his jawline. "I'm not a maid anymore, Lorenzo. I don't know how to be a mob wife. I don't know how to host galas at the Pierre Hotel or sit with the other capos' wives." "You will not sit with them," Lorenzo said fiercely. "You will rule them." He stepped up onto the pedestal with her, invading her space, his chest pressing against her full breasts. "When I tore that hideous coat off you in the courtyard, I didn't just expose you to the cold, Clara. I exposed the truth. You spent your life hiding how much space you take up, because the world told you it was a flaw. But in my world, size, presence, gravity, that is power." Lorenzo took her left hand. On her ring finger sat a massive, flawless, 6-carat emerald-cut diamond, flanked by rubies, the colors of money and blood, the twin pillars of his empire. "You saved my life, Clara. You fought for me when the men who swore blood oaths to me turned their backs." Lorenzo kissed her knuckles. "My empire is yours. My men will bleed for you. My wealth is yours to burn. From this day until the day I die, you are the only law I obey." Clara looked into his dark, obsessive eyes and felt the last remaining fragment of her insecurity shatter. She was fat. She was heavy. She was scarred by poverty and betrayal. But as Lorenzo Bianchi pulled her against his chest, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. "Then let's get married, boss," Clara whispered, pulling his lips down to hers. The shadow of the maid was gone forever, buried beneath the heavy snow of winter. In her place stood the queen, forged in gunfire and wrapped in silk, ready to take her throne. If you were captivated by Clara's journey from a terrified, invisible maid to the fiercely empowered, unapologetic queen of the Bianchi Mafia empire, don't keep this thrilling romance to yourself. Like this video to support more stories that celebrate fierce, curvy heroines who take control of their destiny.